welcome. I am Kelly McMahon. I'm going to get us started. And today we have for our grad partnership community of practice, we're going to get to hear from some really great people. But first, let me tell you a little bit about grad partnership. So these are our grad partnership organizing members, and I see some friendly faces from these organizations here. So welcome to all of you and all of our other members. For the community members that are joining, be great to know who's here with us. So if you get a chance, thank you to Camilla for saying opportunities to grow or things that you're grateful for. I appreciate it. But who's here with us? So if you want to drop into the chat, excuse me, apologize, your name and your organization, your location, where you're joining from. So I can share that I am Kelly McMahon and I am joining from Carnegie Foundation. I'm actually at the foundation today, which is on Stanford's campus in California, sunny California. Give a little moment for people to type and drop their names in. Feel free to say hi to folks. Nice to see some folks from Michigan. I'm originally from Michigan. You may recognize the Midwestern accent. All right, good representation of the Midwest here. We have some folks from Indiana as well. So nice to see you all. All right, at our last community of practice, in asking for feedback from people, this was the feedback that we heard. So people really appreciated getting a chance to hear from the presentation. So we heard from Sarah Gripshalver from PERTS, and she gave us a really wonderful presentation. People enjoyed a chance to speak with colleagues from across the country. They really appreciated the PERTS framework to guide the conversation, knowing that things were grounded in data and research. They appreciated time to process in the group, and then the links and resources that were both shared by Sarah, but also those in the room. So I want to encourage people, as you're hearing things and you want to share, please feel free to drop resources in the chat, because this is a great opportunity for us to share as a group the things that we're learning and the things that we're moved by. And I think we'll have an opportunity to hear a lot of things that we're moved by today. The grad partnership mission is that we are partnering with communities to use high quality student success systems so that schools are empowered to graduate all students ready for the future. And that is our mission that we are working towards. Student success systems. So what are student success systems? They are composed of these sort of four interlocking parts. So we know that involves supportive relationships, actionable data and timely actionable data, student-centered mindsets, and then a whole set of improvement actions that are bringing people together in coordinated ways to engage in continuous improvement to make sure that we're serving students, make sure that they are graduating ready for what comes next, and making sure that they're on track to graduation as they are in schools. And so this is what grad partnerships bring together. Our community of practice, the reason why we're bringing people together is to connect folks who want to implement, improve, and innovate on their student success systems, or what was formerly known as on-track and early warning systems. It enables shared learning. We're hoping to generate motivation and inspiration, and we are defined by our mutual engagement. So thank you all for being here. Some agreements for our time together. It is a we, not me kind of space. So we're hoping to share stories and airtime. We accept non-closure, likely that you're going to hear a lot of big things and big ideas, and that we're going to continue learning and hopefully continue conversations. And we'll try to do what we can in this 1 hour, but hopefully it's again a continuation of it. And so we may not close everything in today's 1 hour time. When we have opportunities to share or things to express, that we build on the ideas, but we keep the details in the communities, because sometimes failures are the really important things to learn from, but we don't always need to be walking around saying, well, in Chicago, they really failed around X, Y, or Z. Instead, it's more important to talk about what we know from and the ideas from it. Share to learn, and that includes, sharing what you know, sharing your ideas, sharing your questions. And then lastly, it's always a lot more fun when we make room for joy. Keeps us coming back to learn together. So those are our community agreements. Today, we're going to hear from Tony Bryk, currently a senior fellow, but formerly the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and also strong connections to the University of Chicago's the Consortium on School Research. and then also Janice Jackson, deep roots in Chicago, but is currently the CEO of Hope Chicago, but was formerly the CEO of Chicago Public Schools. So we're going to hear a lot of their experiences and the stories that they're here to share with us about how the city of Chicago learned, which draws on a book that is forthcoming. I think they're going to tell you a little bit more about that. And just to set us up for today's session, so because we have the opportunity to hear from these two folks, the way it's going to work is Tony's going to give us an overview of how a city learned to improve its schools. And then Janice is going to offer reflections on the work. And at the end of that, we'll do some Q&A. So it's a little bit different format than the way our community practice has run in the past. We're trying this out today for this one session. But as questions are coming up for you, please feel free to take notes of them, or if you want to drop those in the chat and we can bring them forward when it's time for Q&A. But there'll also be a time and space to drop your questions in the chat there. So that's just the format and the overview. And then I will close out after we do some Q&A and discussion. I will close us out towards the end of the hour. There'll be an opportunity to provide some feedback, and I'll point us towards when our next community practice is. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to Tony, who I think is going to share some slides. And yeah, thank you again to Tony and Janice for being here.
Good morning, or afternoon, I guess, for many of you. Can you see my screen? Are we good? All right, thank you. Yes, as Kelly mentioned, I'm delighted to be with you today and happy to share some of what will appear in this book coming out this spring on the 30-year history of how Chicago went about learning to improve its schools. I want to take you back to 1987. This is where the book begins. And literally on the opening page, it draws on this material from the Chicago Tribune. This was the state of the schools in 1987. A picture of despair and hopelessness, 9 teacher strikes in the previous 18 years, longstanding issues of fiscal malfeasance that brought an independent school finance authority into existence, little public trust in the Board of Education, in the central office, or in the Chicago Teachers Union. High school graduation rates had hovered in the 50% range. They've been like that for decades. Chicago standardized test scores were in the upper 20 to 30th percentile range at a time when it seemed like everybody was above average. Chicago was clearly a very troubled school system, arguably one of the most troubled in America. Back then, little in Chicago seemed prime for the transformation that would occur over this next 30 years. Some 30 years later, Some 30 years later, Chicago stood as one of the most improved public school systems in America. High school graduation rates now are above 80%, with the largest of these improvements being seen by Black and Latino males. Moreover, academic standards, going the wrong way. Moreover, academic standards were also rising while these graduation rates were improving. The ACT became a required high school assessment in 2003, and scores have been on the rise ever since. More students are college-bound now too, with enrollments in 2- and 4-year institutions rising from 49% to 70%. Substantial improvements have been documented in elementary schools as well. The best indicator for an individual school or a system of schools is based on the amount of student learning that occurs for a year of instruction. In an improving school, those learning gains should be getting better over time. This slide, drawn from the Stanford Education Project, displays data for school districts across the country. It shows the relationship between school poverty on the, wrong direction again. It shows the direction between school poverty on the x-axis and learning rates on the y-axis. In 1990, the average learning rate for a year of instruction in Chicago in reading and math was 0.84. By 1996, it had risen to 0.94. And by 2010, it had risen to 1.2 years of learning for a year of instruction. That accelerated learning rate placed Chicago at above 96% of the districts in the United States overall. And here too, improvements for students of color were equal to or greater than those of white students. Our book digs into not only what happened in Chicago, but also how and why this system transformation came about. How amidst numerous leadership transitions, 14 superintendents or CEOs in 30 years, how coherent changes emerged and developed that culminated in these improved student outcomes. My talk today shares some of what we've learned. I've organized my remarks into two parts. The first half or so is a capsule summary. Of what unfolded in Chicago. And you could think about this as kind of a movie trailer. In 15 minutes, I'm trying to say a little something about 30 years of reform. The second part is to dig a bit more deeply into a major improvement vignette, how Chicago improves student success in high schools and college going. All right, part one of the story. Let me go back. All right. The political dynamics organizing reform in Chicago grew out of an unusual alliance. And it looks like my picture is frozen. Sorry about that. Grew out of an unusual, I'm having a little trouble controlling this today. The political grew out of an unusual alliance that joined neighborhood and community-based groups with business leaders. This institutional map, 11 major institutions shaping school reform in Chicago. The traditional dynamic when we think about change operates along this vertical axis, from boards through central office down to schools. And in a place like Chicago, you're paying a lot of attention to what organized labor is doing. That's not the story of reform in Chicago. The story of initiating for reform in Chicago began from the outside in citywide groups engaging the business community and leveraging fundamental change through state legislation. So in this regard, Chicago's story is truly a story of democracy at work, citizens challenging a dysfunctional power structure and transforming a major public service system. And that story involves all of the messiness of democracy in action. It's time-consuming character, its productive steps, and often some missteps as well. Chicago's initial lever for reform was school system decentralization in the form of local community control of neighborhood schools. This strategy shaped much of what followed over the next 30 years, and we capture this in the book in the metaphor of the DNA of decentralization as the DNA of reform. One of the most important contributions was in bringing attention to the local school as the key unit of change. Improvement learning emerged inside individual school communities. The role of the principal was transformed into a school community improvement leader, and it catalyzed innovative work on the professional development and preparation and support for school-based leaders. Teachers were now hired by individual schools who selected educators who wanted to work in their particular communities. Decentralization also directed attention to strengthening relationships among school-based educators with families, students, the community. So bring a strong horizontal dimension to the relational structures, counteracting the traditional vertical orientation of people looking up into the system for direction. Accompanying this activity was the evolution of a distinctive civic architecture in support of school improvement that we characterize with a second metaphor, which we call the systems exoskeleton. Brand new organizations emerged to support school improvement, and new centers of work developed within existing organizations. A significant transformation in the operation of local colleges of education was catalyzed as well. So 30 years later, this is now what the institutional reform map looked like. The incredible density of activity across these 11 different institutional sectors. This is what had evolved. Fueling much of this development was Chicago's philanthropic community. They stayed the course for a long period of time, created this kind of cooperative space for schools, the school system, organizations, and the exoskeleton to innovate and develop over time. Like venture capital investing generally, many of the initiatives they supported failed to achieve breakthrough levels, but several of their bets did make significant contributions over the long haul. Many school-based educators and leaders from the exoskeleton organizations eventually moved up into senior district roles and began to rebuild central office capabilities, but now as an office in support of a system of schools. Key in their work was a critical shift as the district embraced partnerships with these organizations in the exoskeleton to redesign how select core central functions might get better executed. So much of our account is about a stunning array of new people, new organizations, and new energy that came alive in Chicago. But one big question remained. How did coherent change emerge out of this seeming cacophony of organizational actors? A competition for attention among them could easily have pulled the system apart, but this did not happen. Interestingly, while within Chicago civic architecture, there was no formally designated citywide coordinating body coordinating this improvement activity. Rather, Chicago operated more along the lines of a dynamic social learning network. This operated through conversations in numerous contexts, including the, oops, let me go back, hide that for a second. In numerous contexts, including elected local school councils, which were created by the 1988 reform, and charter school boards, the civic committee of the commercial club, which is the business elite organization in Chicago, set up specific sub-organizations to support school improvement. There was also a revitalization of the Council of Education Deans in Chicago. In addition, decentralization broke open the traditional barriers that kept people in their institutional silos. Early school-based leaders moved into new roles in the system, into various organizations in the exoskeleton, and there were now people moving back and forth across these spaces. One of the things that we do in the book is we tracked the work histories of 54 of these identified boundary spanners. And you can just see in this visualization how many of them start in schools and then some move up into the organizations, some move out, some move in, and you begin to see this incredible boundary spanning that was occurring in Chicago over this 30-year period of time. In addition, 2 new organizations came into existence specifically to advance the social learning that was occurring around all of these individuals. One was the Consortium that brought an applied research and evaluation capacity to Chicago school reform. And the second was Catalyst, which was a monthly print media aimed at parents and community members. The membership of both the steering committee for the consortium and the editorial board for the Catalyst were deliberately designed to engage and inform these larger citywide efforts. These two boards met typically every 4 to 6 weeks for over a dozen years. And you can see this connectivity in the next slide. You can see how central the role of the consortium, and Catalyst were at creating these learning connections across the city. All right, so this social network function, we argue, operated as the invisible hand, lending coordination and coherence to reform efforts citywide. It's how productive actions emerged amidst the cacophony unleashed by the DNA of decentralization. Now I want to shift and take a look at one of these, what we call boundary objects that were created through this work. The framework on freshmen on track for student success and college going, which came to anchor much of the system-wide improvement efforts in Chicago. It also affords a good example to see how some of the core principles of improvement undergirded and vitalized this work. This initiative was led by 2 consortium senior researchers, Melissa Roderick and John Easton, and I had the good fortune to join them as a colleague in the early stages of getting that work off the ground. So here was the improvement problem. For decades, about 30 students a year started high school in the Chicago public schools, but only half eventually graduated. 15,000 students a year dropping out, year after year after year. As the consortium began its research in the mid-1990s, high school educators lamented these outcomes, but believed there was nothing they could do. They would explain that students often lack the basic skills necessary to do high school work. So in essence, they blame the elementary schools. And they also comment that students lack motivation. They're absent, they cut classes, they don't do homework. This leads to improvement observation number 1. The first stage of an improvement effort typically involves probing prevailing beliefs like this to better understand the actual problems that need to be solved. In the context of persistent failures, like was the case in Chicago, externalizing responsibility for failure is common. In fact, it's rational. When you recognize what's happening, but feel powerless to do anything about it. So the consortium team went out to talk to students as they moved from 8th grade into high school. From the research side, these were qualitative longitudinal case studies using a protocol that was an amalgam of the empathy interviews and journey map tools used in design work and by improvement scientists. Some interesting observations emerged. Most of the students who would eventually drop out came to school regularly as 8th graders. But in the shift into high school, their attendance suddenly became erratic. Why is that? And while some had weak achievement in 8th grade, others were on grade level, and yet they were still failing academic courses in the first semester of high school. Why is that? With these early insights in hand, we turned to longitudinal analyses of extant school system data on the flows of students from elementary school into 9th grade, and then as they move forward over the next 5 years. We learned from these analyses that the problems identified in the case studies were widespread all across the Chicago public schools. The uptick in absenteeism and the shift into high schools was linked to course failure in ninth grade, and course failure in ninth grade in turn linked to dropping out, linked strongly to dropping out of high school in the next year or two. So a key improvement concept had come into focus. Keep students on track for high school success. This takes me to the second improvement observation, the Pareto principle. This principle states that typically 80% of the variation in outcomes is associated with 20% of the causes. To be sure, many factors contributes to students dropping out, but this principle directs us toward identifying the major ones. Something problematic, deeply problematic, was happening in the transition into high school, and it was pervasive. We should work on that. And then one more important observation from this stage of the work. Weak systems operate as leaky pipelines. Individuals are moving through, students are moving through a series of processes, and they tend to get lost along the way. We have to see where the leaks are occurring. Those statistical analyses on the flows of students through the system are often much more illuminating of such problems than the traditional cross-sectional year-by-year accounting reports found in school system data dashboards. Next, Chicago began the shift from understanding the problem into actual improvement learning. Roderick initiated what we would now call a networked improvement community, which eventually grew into what today is the Network for College Success. She started with a group of educators from a small number of schools who believed, as she did, that they can and should be able to do much better. The actual evolution of the improvement effort involved attacking a number of different problems. 4 were major. The first 3 that they attended to was that school-based educators actually didn't know what was happening to every student. They needed easily usable real-time data on students as they were progressing through school. Teachers saw students in a class or a course, but no one saw the full experience of students in a school. So a goal was set to know each student well. And then third, a new work structure evolved. Freshman on-track teams formed to regularly review the progress of all students and to target individual follow-up. As this work proceeded, this takes us to improvement lesson 4. As work of this sort proceeds, they began to identify other issues that needed to be attended to, issues around grading systems, how they work, for example, how issues of student indiscipline was handled, and how larger school-wide concerns about student safety. So a big improvement principle embedded in here is that one has to see the system that's actually generating the unsatisfactory outcomes, and then these iterative processes of testing change. As one goes into this work, working on the first 3 as they started, they began to see other aspects of system policy and processes that were affecting the outcomes they sought to improve. For more details about this work, it's a great book by Emily Crone Phillips called The Make or Break Year. And especially chapters 3 and 6 really take you into this early work on how this grew forward. Key to scaling this initiative was that the superintendent of that, so this early work is starting small. Key to scaling this initiative was the superintendent at the time, Arnie Duncan, was personally engaged in this social learning network. Both Easton and Roderick had strong professional relationships with him, and Duncan valued the consortium research in this area. On Track became a regular part of what he talked about with his central staff, with supervisors of the school principals, and his conversations around the city. A strong collaboration grew between his staff and consortium staff as they partnered on developing and refining the new just-in-time data that schools needed. Other offices worked on incorporating on-track into the principal evaluation feedback processes. On-track data became a small part of the school report card, and the framework was adopted both in the system's professional development offerings and in the professional preparation programs in area colleges of education. In short, this central support, operating in tandem with initiatives out in schools and in the exoskeleton, moved on track into the reform water. Attention to student on track continues to this day, some 13 years after Duncan left and some 20 years after it all began. So this takes me to my last improvement observation. Achieving reforms at scale is akin to an organic growth phenomenon. There is no shortage of good reform ideas, but the technical know-how and expertise to execute on them is typically woefully underdeveloped. And so organizations tend to fall victim to what are referred to as the 3 I's. Illusion, a belief that some idea is so powerful that it will just overwhelm any pedestrian logistical constraints. Incompetence, a failure to recognize and appreciate the requisite knowledge and skill needed to advance a change, especially at scale. And the third one, impatience, a belief that events can actually be achieved faster than the facts warrant. The large-scale impact achieved by On Track in Chicago proves highly illustrative in a response to each of these points. The hub for the Network for College Success started with a small group of principals and their schools. 3 important things evolved out of this early work. Participants took an idea, how do we keep students on track, and figured out how to move this. And how to move this idea forward, how to design processes, roles, organizational routines to execute well. Second thing that happened is the educators who made it work in schools became mentors for others to learn how to make this work. And then third, they also became evangelizing leaders for the spread of this work more broadly across the system. One of them, she's coming. There she is. One of them, Janice Jackson, became the superintendent, CEO of the Chicago Public Schools 10 years later. Hers was a remarkable, you'll hear from Janice in a moment, a remarkable development in that she was the first Chicago public school educator, came up through the system to lead that system in some 30 years. In closing, this discussion that these points I've just raised, they represent a very different way of thinking about advancing reforms at scale. It means moderating the traditional premium placed on rapid, broad-based implementation of some new programs and policies. While such actions respond to a felt need to act decisively, they often lead to promising more than is realistically possible. Some successes can emerge here and there, but overall improvement tends to remain limited. In contrast, the big effects documented in the Chicago story were anchored in building an improvement infrastructure in the city's exoskeleton, in the district central office, and in the partnership between them. Continuous attention was paid to design, test, and refine core processes while continuing to learn from this work how to get better at what they sought to achieve. I'll close with an analogy. This form of scaling is akin to planting a seedling in a garden. I like to garden, so where the analogy comes from. Initially, that seedling doesn't look like much. While only a few small new leaves may appear above ground, beneath the ground, a vibrant root system is growing and taking hold. And that plant begins to, in air quotes, come alive. New and larger leaves emerge and rapid growth now occurs. But none of this is possible without developing that strong root system. This is part of what Chicago teaches us, the power of developing strong roots for improvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate it. And now I would like to turn it over to Janice, who, I think you'll be able to tell a little bit more of your story, but welcome an opportunity to hear your reflections on the story that was shared. What would you add to it? What do you think are important parts to highlight? Welcome a chance to just hear your insights.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Tony, for teeing this up. And I also want to start by thanking Tony and all of the authors who contributed to this work for really documenting what has been decades of work and love to get Chicago to this place. I think there are so many important stories embedded in what has happened, and it's impossible to really discuss all of that in an hour, but I hope that I hope that your interest is piqued in a way that pushes you to continue to look at the lessons from Chicago, some good, some bad, but also what the implications may be for the work that you're currently engaged in. So as was stated, I'm a lifelong resident of Chicago. And when I listen to Tony talk about this evolution, I have to go back to like the place and time that I was in when these different things were happening. As you can imagine, as a student at the time of the original kind of onset of a lot of this reform, I was less aware of the Tribune's assessment of what was happening in CPS, not aware of the now infamous statement from the then Secretary of Education, who, by the way, doesn't deserve to be quoted. You can Google him and see some of his other famous quotes. So what he said about Chicago is probably one of the least offensive things. But I didn't experience those things as a student in the same way that it's outlined in the book, but definitely saw the shifts happening. I saw more parent leadership happening as a result of local school councils. I saw the way schooling was transformed, where there was much more of a focus on what happened in high school and post-secondary transition. As a principal and teacher early on in a lot of these, in the different phases of this reform, definitely saw the district transform and start to take a much more strategic approach to addressing some of these issues. And I think the diagram, which is a lot when you look at it, that describes this exoskeleton as Tony outlined, I think it's fitting because it is a very complicated system of relationships and ways in which people engaged and operated. But I think if you want to boil it down to a simple way to think about it for, those of you who are doing this work every single day, it really is about how do you manage those internal and external relationships in order to advance student achievement? I think, it wasn't a perfect system at all, but I definitely think Chicago is ahead of a lot of spaces in that there is this strong connectivity between the philanthropic community, the research-based community located in our city, as well as the school system. I think one of the most important relationships we have is the relationship with the Consortium on School Research, which I'm still surprised, as I said here in 2022, that we don't have more of those kind of relationships across the country where, reputable research institutions like Chicago have unfettered access to the data that is occurring in schools. That it was single-handedly, along with a bunch of other things, instrumental in the progress that we made around graduation rates, the on-track rate. I know firsthand as a principal, I felt empowered, like I could actually do something about on track, where, I was working in a neighborhood school, no selection criteria. My average reading scores for my students at the time at 9th grade was maybe 5th or 6th grade. So it's really hard to feel like you can get everybody up to junior level in 3 years, but I could definitely track students and see how they're doing in school intervene when necessary, provide resources to help them get on track. And as a result, Al-Raby, which is the school where I started, as well as countless schools across the district, saw tremendous impact with regard to student achievement. And so I think there are a lot of lessons there. The other way that I think about this is, how do you use the people, the policies, as well as the resources that you have to move this work along? And, we didn't just go and learn from University of Chicago or learn from some of the other folks who were stepping up to help us bring about some of the reform efforts that Tony talks about in his book. But it really was about, how do we take that learning and leverage it into practices that people engaged in every single day? How do we make this a part of policy? On Track is an example of that. When I started with On Track, we were working with Network for College Success, and it was just something that interested principals were doing. And because we saw the result of that and the improvements, things like that became basically structural. They were a part of our student performance and school quality policy. I feel like we've gotten away from that in the ed space, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I close out with implications. But I think that a lot of those levers were very important levers to bring about improvement. I think the other thing that I would double down on is the use of data to drive improvement. That is something that, it's not without people pushing back and having concerns about it. But at the end of the day, I remember exactly where I was when the consortium published the results of the potholes report that talked about the fact that less than 10% of CPS students graduated from college by the age of 25. That was jarring to see, because that was the work I was doing and engaged in every day, but it also was affirming and empowering because it gave us a North Star to reach for. And it made for more accountability in a good way that I think a lot of our districts need. When I talk to superintendents and other folks engaged in this work across the country, I'm still surprised at how few people actually know where they stand, and it's, undergirded by robust data systems that kind of tell you this is what's going on and this is how you make progress. And so I think that that was definitely instrumental. And then the final piece is how you use the people that you have. There's a heavy emphasis, and he talks about this in the book. I believe Tim weighed in on this chapter about teacher leadership and teacher quality, I should say, and the importance of principal leadership as well. And so you need staff, you need people in order to lead this work, in order for it to be successful. So how do you both recruit, which is a huge challenge right now, but also train and prepare people to do this work? It's a heavy lift. And so I want people to leave this conversation knowing that this took, decades to achieve some of these improvements. I would also share with you candidly, having led through the pandemic, that these things are easily disrupted, and the pandemic definitely has caused CPS, and I'm sure other school districts, to lose ground on some of these things that we have been making dramatic improvement in over time. But I do firmly believe that a lot of the lessons and systems that we have in place will help us recover a lot faster than people who haven't been engaged in this work for a long time. And so just in closing, what are the implications? Why read this book now? I could imagine some of you are sitting here thinking, this is not my reality. Schooling is different now, post-pandemic, and all of that is most certainly true. But what I think the value here is, the value lies within the fact that we're all struggling to identify what's our plan to reset or recover after COVID. And I think that it might not be the same concepts, but I think the principles and the approaches have a lot of validity, and they could be implemented to bring about any kind of changes that you're trying to implement in your district. I think the book does a really good job of talking about how to manage these complicated relationships to advance student achievement. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think some of the principles that led to our progress are under attack right now or being ignored. And, for folks who are still working in this space, it really is incumbent upon you to keep driving towards results. Some of those things include focusing on teacher and principal quality. We've gotten away from that during the pandemic, focusing on student achievement and data to help drive instruction and really to tell us how we're doing and to push us to do better, because our kids have already had life-changing experiences that, you know, we haven't even begun to study and uncover and understand as a result of the pandemic. And I think you're doing that in a time that's very different. The staffing capacity and staffing issues are much greater today than they were 30 years ago, 5 years ago when I was doing this work, right? And then I think some of the other issues that have emerged around SEL support and mental health and some of these other things that people who are working in schools have to grapple with make this work even more complicated. And so I would just encourage people to, you know, dig in once this is available for your review. But I think the structure in the approach has resonance everywhere. And depending on what you are going to prioritize in your district, I think there is a lot to be learned from what happened here in Chicago. And I will stop there because we want to make sure we have enough time for questions from the group. So thank you for this opportunity, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janice. I really appreciate it. Well, giving folks time to drop questions in the chat, because we don't have any yet. Would love for people to drop their questions in if you have them. I will take a liberty. I'm going to take MC liberties here and ask a question. Given, I think, Janice, your last comment about how people are feeling like the press of the current time and how difficult it can be to do work, but knowing that the power of the relationships is so important. I think sometimes relationships can feel extra. Can you guys talk a little bit about how or what the opportunities were to create some of those relationships, other than, you know, people moving from, say, a school to a new position or different role, but what were some of the ways in which how did you create space for building those relationships?
I would say by the time I started leading, a lot of this stuff was a part of the structure. So I would defer to Tony to maybe talk about how some of those things were created. But I will say, as a leader of the district, I felt an incredible sense of responsibility to maintain those relationships. So relationships with the philanthropic community, the post-secondary institutions in our city, folks who are deeply concerned and still are deeply concerned to this day around how students in CPS perform. I just felt my responsibility was to maintain those relationships. But I'll let Tony talk about how we got there, because I'm sure there are a lot of interesting stories embedded in that.
That's a really interesting question. I do think that I hadn't thought about this particular question before, but my inclination is to go back to this idea of decentralization as the DNA of reform. It was well, we wrote a book about this earlier on, democratic localism, but it's this, that was the spirit of that launched everything. But in the essence of democracy is people from different backgrounds coming together to find spaces where they solve problems in the commons together. But it's fundamentally a relational concept. And the reform opened that up, which is different from traditionally, well, there's a bureaucracy and they're supposed to solve the problem. And if you don't like what you're doing, you replace the person at the top. This was which is why, and the title for the book, we didn't invent it. It actually came out of the first convening that we did in Chicago in planning and opening up this book. But it became really clear, this was really a story about a city learning to improve its schools and this relational structure. And I do link that back to that opening. Well, even how the reform came about, it came from the outside in. And it just opened up this space for not only new people to enter, but very different, for new forms of relationships to form as well.
Thanks, Tony. We have a question. Thank you, Anu, for your question. She says, you talked about the importance of decentralized approach, and also the importance of a superintendent and district office. Yeah. Could you elaborate on the relationship between like being decentralized and yet the importance of having that the role that the central office and superintendent played?
Well, it was, I mean, there's a fundamental tension in there. And that's for someone at the top of the system, managing that tension is an ongoing concern. But one example of it, I think, which Janice mentioned, was the sustained attention to development of school-based leaders, particularly people who would move into school principalship roles, and how this was the recognition that the local school site was the key unit for change, and that the school and that leadership there was really central, and how the system worked in partnership with College of Education, particularly University of Illinois at Chicago, and a new organization, the fund, came into existence to partially support this as well. So this is an interesting, and it's kind of a middle space where traditionally the traditional mechanism is the system center appoints the principals. And the appointment authorities still stayed out there with local school councils. But then the question is, what can the system do to strengthen the quality of the people who are actually being reviewed for possible appointments? So it's a very different, and that's where there was very constructive system level actions where Chicago actually introduced standards that were more intensive than existed for the rest of the state of Illinois. So there were ways in which policy action actually strengthened processes that the system didn't directly control. It didn't directly appoint all the individual principals, but there were ways in which these things could work together. I think the place where this is most challenging, and I suspect right now is still very much, this was, I know, Janice, as you were, before you left, one of your initiatives was to really come up with a much more ambitious system of curriculum for Chicago public schools, and how challenging that is. I mean, it's a challenging task as is, but in a system that's decentralized, decisions about what curriculum will be used in each individual school there's a lot of local control still that exists. So how do you take something that's intrinsically a system reform, a strong curriculum with aligned professional development, aligned assessment systems, and get that to work inside a system of schools? But so these tensions continue to be embedded in the operation of a system like Chicago, but they also reflect, I think, an essential feature of big urban districts. There's this great pluralism of communities and perspectives about what our schools should do. And you got to create some slack in the system that allows some different ideas to emerge about how things that are inherently contested might get played out differently in different schools.
I think
There's a whole story about English language learners that in the book that actually deals with it in that context, about how that developed in Chicago.
Yeah, I was just going to add that in a district as large as Chicago, 660 schools, it's virtually impossible for a superintendent or a central office, no matter how many employees you have, to kind of manage that stuff day to day. So it is a smart strategy, but also a necessary strategy to empower site-based leadership in order to do that. What I will say, where I have seen site-based leadership fail, is when there's no accountability structure there to catch that. So if you think about the example Tony just raised around curriculum, that works when you have access to data to mandate things. So for example, we created a district-wide system. We have different examples I can highlight like that. But the difference is, if you do not meet certain standards, you don't get the autonomy to say, I'm not doing that. But what I've seen happen in school districts is that you want to mandate instruction, mandate certain things, but don't really have the accountability systems in place to really say to people that this is necessary and to prove that whatever they've been doing either works or doesn't work. And it happens the opposite way as well. We've had people through our independent schools program, they're able to opt out of things because they've proven success. and this is not just in selective enrollment schools or schools where students are selected, they have proven success, they see growth, they prove that they're organized based on the 5 essential survey, et cetera. And so once you demonstrate capacity based on data, then you earn that autonomy. But when you create that autonomy and site-based leadership without any kind of accountability, it will fail and that tension will become even greater.
And
Thank you,
that's
Janice.
this is the tension of managing a system of schools. I mean, it's just wonderful account of it.
Yeah, thank you. And we know we're getting close to time, but Janice, there was a question in the chat that if you could briefly tend to, but what did family engagement look like within CPS during this time, or perhaps touch on a little of what I imagine it changed over the 30 years, but something to pull forward about family engagement.
Well, I think what was happening right at the beginning of this, and Tony can speak to this better than I can, is the establishment of local school councils, which for folks who are unfamiliar with that structure, just think 660 mini school boards. Every school in Chicago, well, there's a group that don't have local school councils and charters do not, but essentially there's a board made up of mainly parents, teachers, community members, and at the high school level, at least one student. And they have 3 big functions. They hire and retain the principal, they approve the budget, and they improve the school improvement plan, which is incredibly important. Activists fought hard to get that. And I think that played a big role in the improvement of our school system. Fast forward, during my tenure, it looked like more structures in place. In addition to the local school councils, which have had, ups and downs, we have parent advisory councils, a lot of these formal structures, bilingual advisory councils, who really support the policy, agenda that we have in our district. They don't speak for every parent, but they are representative of the parents. And so I think from a district level, that's how we have engaged parents. There's much more structure in place to do that through these formal committees than maybe what existed, 30 or 40 years ago. But I would still say that there's still some of the same challenges of making sure there's diversity and representation, and that you're seeing and hearing more from students and families that don't have money and other social capital that gives them the kind of access to speak to decision makers. So still a long way to go there, but we've put a lot of systems in place to engender more parent engagement.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I imagine the 5 E's, or the rise of the 5 E's also, which called on measuring and actually attending to the role of involved families. So I'll drop that in the chat.
Yeah, another way policy move practice. Yep.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, and I know there's so much more lessons that we could pull from both of you. So I just thank you so much, Tony and Janice, for being here with us and with us in community. And I think there's a lovely line that Kylie has put in the chat as a comment. Someone who's watched school leaders in Chicago, she lives in Chicago, works our colleague from AIR. And she's watched the leaders in Chicago engage with their data at NCS-led workshops, so Network for College Success, and a parent who's gone on 12 high school tours. I knew you were busy, Kylie, but that's a lot. And you can hear leaders talk about the importance of freshman year and their freshman on-track rates in meaningful ways. The level to which leaders in Chicago are committed to this work is unparalleled. So thank you for your work, and I think that's a nice testament for why we should all keep learning from and paying attention to the work in Chicago. So thank you. And for everyone else, I look forward to seeing you again on December 14th, when we're going to dig into our definition of high quality student success systems. And we'll hear from Bob Balfance and a couple others. So please join us then. And there'll be a link for the survey. As always, we welcome your feedback on this. So thank you for everyone joining. And I hope everyone is well, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you. Bye.